Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this episode of Defense News Weekly, a look at what's coming up at AUSA, one of the biggest defense conferences of the year. From competing next-generation weapons to Army modernization priorities on a grand scale, our team tees up the biggest stories. Plus, an interview with retired General Stanley McChrystal, former commander of Joint Special Operations Command, and a look at a possible Russian hypersonic missile launch. Finally, a new way the Army is working on battling altitude sickness for troops operating in alpine environments. It's the latest news and analysis from the Pentagon to the platoon, here on Defense News Weekly. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Andrea Scott. One of the biggest defense events of the year is the annual Association of the U.S. Army Conference. The Defense News team brings us an inside look at some of the big money and personnel stories from the show floor.
The U.S. Army is having its conference once again in 2021 after a year of having it virtually. Jen, Todd, we'll be at the conference. We'll be on the show floor the whole time. You'll be up at the speeches. Jen, let's start with you. What can we expect this year at AUSA?
You know, it's going to be important to the Army to acknowledge how they're going to be operating as climates become more severe, as climate change happens. They need to know how to operate in hotter climates, in colder. The Army also rolled out an Arctic strategy earlier this year that couches pretty nicely with a climate strategy because they're going to have to learn how to better operate in the Arctic as well. So we'll be watching for that. I think another conversation that we're going to be hearing a lot is modernization priorities. Will the Army be able to preserve those priorities in the coming budgets? Those budgets are expected to be flat or they're expected to decline. And so I think that we'll hear the Army explain that they're going to be able to preserve the modernization priorities again in fiscal year 2023, the next budget cycle.
Jen, does the Army have enough information for it to go forward on the climate strategy? Are there enough studies that have been completed?
I mean, I believe so. We'll have to see what the climate strategy says to get a sense of how well they're understanding things. But the Biden administration really wants to accelerate climate change studies and their strategy, and they're putting money towards that. The Pentagon has been doing that even in the Trump administration. The Army, I think, acknowledges that they're going to have to operate in places like the Arctic. And there's coastal erosion. The Arctic is going to have a whole new ocean to operate in. And so these are all things that the Army is concerned about. And just being able to, operate in climates that are obviously changing. It's getting hotter and hotter. Are soldiers going to be able to train in 90-degree days? Probably not. There's going to be more 90-degree days every year. So how is the Army going to cope with that? And so hopefully we'll see some of those answers in the strategy.
Will any of the information there change the modernization strategy?
I mean, it's hard to tell. I don't believe so because I think a lot of the modernization efforts are going to take into account some fuel efficiencies, things like that. I think that it's absolutely on the table for like the optionally manned fighting vehicle to potentially be hybrid or at least more fuel efficient. They're looking at making robotic combat vehicles potentially all electric or hybrid. There's a lot of opportunities to be greener. So we'll just see how that unfolds.
And on the personnel side, Todd, is there anything that you're looking at that might be coming out of AUSA?
Oh yeah, I think starting out the gate, General Michael Garrett with the U.S. Army Forces Command is going to be talking about the REARM, the Regionally Aligned Readiness and Modernization Model. It's really kicking into full strength this coming year, and it kind of overlaps with some of the stuff that Jen said about modernization, but also folds in training and deployments. So what they're trying to do is essentially align, like they say in the acronym, align the regions to different units, make sure different units are working with different combatant commands, different Army commands, but also finding time within the schedule to modernize as they train and remain ready and also deploy. deploy, because they can't stop everything just to modernize, and they can't stop modernization just to go train and deploy. So it's kind of a mixed match model of that. It's a little more sophisticated than what they've used in the past, and it's going to try to accomplish a lot of goals, spinning a lot of plates the Army has to handle.
One thing we'll see at the show floor that we can see, you can actually grab, will be different versions of the SAW replacement, of the squad automatic weapon. What are you expecting there?
Right, we're coming to almost the fruition of the next generation squad weapon program. It's possible to down select by next year. In fact, they're choosing the fire control, the optic already this year for that weapon. There's 3 competitors. You've got 6 Sauer, who provided the new pistol for the Army. It's more of a conventional, very familiar kind of weapon, very designed much like you would see a typical assault rifle. Then you've got, of course, the Textron systems, which is a caseless telescope ammunition. It's like a plastic polymer case. The bullet is inside the case, so it saves weight, saves space, but still has the same performance. And you also have General Dynamics has an entry which uses a bullpup design. It shortens the weapon, thereby providing better balance and a little bit more accuracy by putting the magazine behind the hand guard and the trigger housing. And all of those are going to be in 6.8 millimeter, which is a brand new caliber that's never been fired by U.S. military as far as a standardized weapon. And it's a big improvement on the 5.56.
Why is that a big improvement on the 5.56?
It's got essentially more power and range, more lethality. You can shoot out to 600 meters versus 300 meters. It can be lethal at 600 meters. It actually outperforms even the larger bullet, the 7.62 millimeter, which is in the 240 machine gun and some sniper rifles. So it's a smaller caliber round that is easier and more convenient to pack than a heavier machine gun, but has the same performance.
Do you know if soldiers have any thoughts on a bullpup design?
It's not the most popular design with most U.S. shooters. It's very European. A lot of the European countries have it. They sing its praises, but just culturally, I think it's not really gone over well in the U.S. so far. But we'll see what the competition has to say.
The Army's going through modernization. There's always going to be new technology there. What can you expect to see, Jen?
Yeah, so there's a lot of competitions on the horizon for modernization priorities. We're going to see most likely something related to the mobile protective firepower, capability for infantry brigade combat teams. BAE Systems and GDLS, General Dynamics Land Systems, are competing for that. A decision is expected in fiscal year 2022, so it's coming up who will be the winner of that. We'll also see BAE Systems and GDLS bringing technology development into vehicles at the show for the optionally manned fighting vehicle. These will not be the vehicle designs, but they will showcase some of the technology that the companies are interested in putting into that. There are 3 other competitors for the OMFV initial design phase, which is just to look at how to design the vehicle. It's not looking at designing the vehicle. So
that's a Bradley replacement, right?
Exactly, that's a Bradley replacement. So we'll see Oshkosh and a Hanwha team, the South Korean company, will be there likely with technology as well. And then a smaller company, Point Blank, is also designing for the competition, as well as Rheinmetall and a Raytheon team.
That's a big show.
Yes.
Pandemic, no pandemic. It's going to be a lot of technology there. We'll see what the turnout is. Todd, there's going to be you're going to see some training and technology?
Definitely, yeah. With some of the deployments somewhat winding down, like other than exercises, there's more time and space to do training, and the Army's dumping a lot of resources into technology for that training. So you're going to see some things from the Maneuver Center of Excellence and from the Fire Center of Excellence. They're extending training. They're adding, experimenting with new types of units to work with these new platforms to be more effective in kind of the great power competition, large-scale combat operations. Training kind of follows and flows with that. Even little things like, at the Maneuver Center, the infantry guys, the grunts are getting, brand new GPSs. So if they get lost on the land nav course, if they have a heat casualty, they can get called up and they can get, rescued pretty quickly or get some kind of relief. They've also got a digital sand table. Basically, you stand on your sand table and can look around with goggles and see everything that's going on before you step out on that mission. Way advanced from like MRE boxes and sand and shoe boxes, kind of stuff we used to do, back in the day. So the training is leaping forward with both time, expansion, and technology for sure.
And this is the biggest acquisition show here in D.C., arguably. If you had to pick between one movie, Pentagon Wars or War Dogs, both acquisition movies in a sense, what would you pick, Jen?
Pentagon Wars. That is a movie I will rewatch 1,000 times, just to laugh at all the things. I mean, it's all the things I've covered. It's all the troubles that the Army has had. We'll see if they can. I hope we don't have a repeat of that movie with the Bradley replacement going forward, but they're taking a very different approach than they did during the Pentagon Wars. So I am looking forward to seeing how that comes out.
It's always interesting. Acquisitions always got something going on. Todd?
I'm going to choose War Dogs, just as my first love is small arms and shoulder fighter rockets, and those guys sold a hell of a lot of them. And as a prior service Marine, I just like shooting stuff.
Both good movies, both worth watching. Defense News will have a booth down on the showroom floor, so make sure to swing by. We'll have Defense News masks. Make sure to pick one up. And now it's time for defense industry headlines. Oshkosh Defense has won a $16.7 million contract to provide 3 types of heavy expanded mobility tactical trucks, as well as heavy equipment transporters to Lebanon, Iraq, and Malaysia. The heavy expanded mobility tactical truck is more commonly known as the HEMTT. Oshkosh will deliver different versions of the truck, including a tanker that can transport 2,500 gallons of fuel. Another version has a 75-ton maximum payload. The deal will allow for 80 trucks delivered to 3 countries. Each truck has a value of $200,000, and the remaining costs will go to maintenance. That deal was announced on September 22nd, and its estimated completion date is January 31st, 2022. Combatant commanders will soon have access to radio frequency emission data from around the world. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency has issued a $10 million contract to commercial satellite company Hawkeye 360 to help it detect and map radio frequency emissions all over the world. The company says its service will be used for NGA analytics, helping the agency detect and track military and criminal activities. Additionally, the company says that the combatant commanders will have access to that data. Hawkeye 360 currently operates 9 RF monitoring satellites, and it has plans to launch another 21 through next year. The planned 30 satellite constellation will be able to provide collection revisits every 20 minutes. 30 satellites is a starting point. The company plans to double that number by 2025. Germany is upping its submarine hunting game. Boeing announced a contract with the U.S. Navy to produce 5 P-8A Poseidon maritime surveillance and anti-submarine aircraft that are destined for the German Sea Service. The September 28th award marks the latest step in Germany's quest for urgently needed replacements for its aging P-3C Orion planes. Officials say the Poseidon combat aircraft fits Germany's requirement of offering a mix of sensor capabilities and combat punch needed to target adversarial submarines. Earlier this summer, German lawmakers approved the purchase in principle. The deal is estimated to be worth $1.6 billion, which includes taxes and extras such as training and support. Germany is set to start receiving the new aircraft as of 2024. This isn't Germany's ultimate anti-submarine plan. A German defense spokesperson told Defense News that the country is sticking to its previous plans with France to jointly develop the Maritime Airborne Warfare System. That's an entirely new sub-hunting weapon that is slated for 2035. And here's an interesting fact. The Poseidon uses a Boeing 737 chassis, so you might have been something similar. And that's it from the defense side of the house this week. When we come back, a look at a possible Russian hypersonic missile launch and a conversation with General Stanley McChrystal.
Welcome back. When it comes to hypersonic weapons, several major countries say they're all in a secretive hunt for next-generation technology. The Russians planted a new flag in that race recently with what they said was video of the launch of one of the weapons from a submarine. Russian officials claim the missile hit a mock target in the Barents Sea. In other news, the VA has reported a sobering pandemic benchmark. More than 15,000 Veterans Affairs patients had died of COVID-19 related complications, the agency reported last week. The milestone equates to roughly 26 deaths a day since the pandemic began in the US about 19 months ago. And Marine aviators made a little history this week with the first takeoffs and landings from a Japanese vessel since World War II. A pair of F-35B Lightnings operated off the Japanese carrier Izumo as part of an early test for expanding Marine flights off of Japanese ships in the future. And next up, retired General Stanley McChrystal was the commander of the Joint Special Operations Command during the Obama administration. Out with a new book recently, McChrystal spoke with Military Times Pentagon Bureau Chief Megan Myers about a range of topics, including the U.S.'s recent withdrawal from Afghanistan.
You mentioned the war on terror, and I wanted to take you back there, especially because of the news right now. You know, I'm sitting in the Pentagon. That's the thing that's on a lot of our readers' minds right now. You said that there were some, there were some good things, there were some wins, there were some poor decisions. In your distance from it now and from your time in command, what have you learned since that you think could have helped you back then?
Well, I think that we learned it as we went along, but the reality was Al-Qaeda and other threats were significant, but they weren't huge. I mean, they were pretty limited in size and their ability to hurt us. And yet our weakness came from being disconnected. If you look at 9/11, for example, all the information necessary to stop the 9/11 attacks existed inside the United States government. And yet we couldn't connect the dots. We couldn't bring the different parts together. And it wasn't because people were stupid or lazy or evil. It was because we'd allowed our organizational cultures and our habits to be one where the dots weren't connected. If we went forward in our response after that, Americans are a bit impatient. We want a rapid, kinetic response to the problem. And so we mounted efforts, some of which were very good, our ability to go after and actually hunt down terrorists. And we turned out that we're pretty good at that. But the problem with terrorism lies upstream or left of the boom when they talk about IEDs in Iraq. You've got to get at the cause of terrorism. So the solution to terrorism is not the terrorist who's carrying a weapon or planting a bomb. The solution to terrorism is the group that is in fertile ground creating future terrorists.
So I'm sure you can tell where all of this is leading, but the wrap up of Afghanistan and the lessons learned and the postmortem that we're going to see coming out of this, a big focus of that is how did this go on for 20 years and then, poof, like that in a couple of weeks at the end. And there's a long, record of leadership saying one thing in briefings, saying one thing when they're testifying on the Hill.
That transition is occurring. And I would point to that as an example of the success, as an example of the successful outcome of the investment that has been made by this country and the other countries of the coalition, ultimately to deny the Taliban the opportunity to ever overthrow this government again.
And then, something very different is going on behind the scenes, whether that's with progress in training Afghan troops, progress with establishing the government in Afghanistan, or simply, progress with actually reducing a terror threat. So where do you think the buck stops, or how do you think we, kind of reckon with the idea that our leaders were very focused on, broadcasting the positives, on focusing on what they could control, and sometimes to the detriment of other things that were getting away from them?
Yeah, complicated question. It's simple to ask, and the easy one would be, well, people are out there and one of two things is true. They're either stupid or they're dishonest. They're either too stupid to understand what's happening or they're dishonest in their reporting. I didn't see either of those. What I saw was people given tasks. They are trying to get those tasks done. There is progress. Afghanistan is not the same country it was in 2001. The Taliban may be in charge, but it's a different place now and a different society. And some of that was done by people who've done this. At the same time, the reality is, you've got somebody focused on a narrow task and the bigger reality or the weaknesses either aren't in their lane or they don't feel like they are the right person to report that. Or in some cases, they get fixated on, I think I can do that. Remember that a leader who's given a task and's got a bunch of people doing that task, take the Hill. And if you go to that leader and say, can you take that hill? And the leader goes, 50-50, I don't know. The troops behind that leader are going, hey, what's going on here? You're asking me to assault the hill and you're saying, you don't think we can do it? So it's a paradox. The leader who is going to succeed at something hard has to believe, has to lean forward, has to enthusiastically bring his people along. So the idea that it is dishonesty is not what I saw. Now, I didn't see everything, but in my sense, there were people trying to get it done who believed that it was possible.
And that's it for your military news. When we come back, it's your weekly Money Minute with tips on using a prepaid debit card as a budgeting tool. And later, a new way to fight altitude sickness. On this edition of Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal finance expert Jeanette Mack walks you through using a prepaid debit card as a budgeting tool.
According to a recent study, Americans have over 5 billion prepaid debit cards. Prepaid debit cards work much like a checking account, providing access to cash with no need for a credit check. So why would you opt for a prepaid debit card if you already have a checking account and a debit card? Prepaid debit cards are a great way to stay within a set budget, especially when you travel or go on vacation. You can load a specific amount of money you don't want to go over onto your card like you would a debit card and spend without the worry of overspending. You also don't risk getting into credit card debt. It's a great way for parents who want to teach their teen or college student a responsible spending habit too. You can track purchases and reload the card anytime through online banking. Many lenders offer zero liability protection for any unauthorized transactions, so you can have peace of mind with card protection. Be sure you read the fine print too, so you can avoid any unnecessary fees from things like out-of-network ATMs. There are all kinds of ways to budget, but if you're looking for a fast and simple way to keep your spending under control, look no further than a prepaid debit card.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more military and defense news, be sure to check out Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps Times.com and DefenseNews.com for the latest stories and coverage. And to get a list of top stories in your email every weekday, subscribe to our Early Bird Brief. And follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And when we come back, the Army tries to fight back against nature in looking to protect troops from the effects of high-altitude combat. Welcome back. To be an effective global force, the Army wants to be able to fight everywhere: jungles, deserts, and high in the mountains. But one pitfall of fighting in alpine areas is what's known as acute mountain sickness, an altitude-related illness that strikes in unpredictable patterns. Military Times' Todd South takes a look at an Army effort to better manage the problem.
When soldiers go to high altitudes, say above 12,000 feet, they can easily be affected by a condition known as acute mountain sickness. The problem is there's no way to predict really right now who's going to be affected by it. The Army's working on a tool for that. Army researchers took 41 soldiers from an engineer unit in Missouri to Taos, New Mexico this past summer to study the effects of acute mountain sickness. They're trying to develop this tool that will help better predict, with at least 80% or 90% accuracy, who's going to get sick. See, the problem is 3 different soldiers could have 3 different reactions. One could go up there and be debilitated for up to 72 hours. Another just might have a light headache, and a third might have no problems at all. And there's really no good way to predict right now. For years, they've been using questionnaires. The problem is soldiers think they're too tough. They basically don't complain about problems until they really affect them and they're out for the count. This new way of measuring blood samples, other types of biometrics, is finding ways to really predict with good accuracy, with an algorithm, who's going to get sick and how they need to treat them either ahead of time or condition them for the operation or the mission. So for decades, when high-altitude mountaineers had to go to an area, say in the Himalayas, to climb Mount Everest, they would go days or weeks ahead of time to acclimatize to the place. They would work their way up in stages, work their way back down and sleep. Their blood would become more acclimatized, their oxygen levels would get better, and they could operate at high altitudes. That's for extreme mountaineers. Well, soldiers don't have that luxury. They have to sometimes go straight into an operation at a higher altitude and work their way down, or a lower altitude and work their way up. So there's all kinds of variables that scientists have to configure to understand what's going to happen to a person and how they can react in short notice. Now, in the past, they've tried to do conditioning for certain extended operations, but for more shorter term, they've done pre-medication, basically giving people drugs ahead of time that will help mitigate those symptoms. The problem is they don't know who's going to be affected. Also, the drugs aren't always effective themselves, sometimes as low as 30 to 50%, and the drugs have side effects. So these new tools can actually help a commander or even a small unit leader, such as a squad or platoon leader, decide who in their unit might need preconditioning, might need these pre-medications, or may just not be able to take part of that mission because they're too sensitive to what might happen to them at altitude. So basically, what researchers are going to do is take reams of data that they've collected over the summer with these 41 soldiers, process that into some more information and new data to send off to Army Medical. Army Medical probably in 2022 are going to be able to evaluate this to see if they can actually release it as a tool to commanders to use if it's validated through their processes. So this is cutting edge research on the forefront of altitude work. And it's important because soldiers may be leaving Afghanistan now, but there are other high altitude areas where they could face competition, such as parts of Asia with China, even parts of Europe with Russia. Because if you're going to fight at altitude, you got to be able to breathe. And that's how this could be effective for future operations. For Military Times, I'm Todd South.
And that's all we have time for this week. Please visit us on militarytimes.com and defensenews.com for more coverage. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.